Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So, in our homeworks, we've analyzed Grendel, we've analyzed Dear Old Mum, but we haven't really talked about Dear Mr. Dragon, and we're not going to. The reason is that for our purposes, the dragon just isn't that interesting. He's a dragon, he does what dragons do, and that's pretty much that. So here, I'm just going to give a quick overview of what happens in part 3, and that should be enough to get you guys through the last bit of this Beowulf module. Basically, it's mostly about Beowulf fighting this dragon and then dying, and it's rounded out by a number of lengthy narrative digressions. Personally, I like to divide this final third of the poem into 4 mini-sections. First, after Beowulf kills Grendel's mother, there's a lot of feasting, a lot of drinking, a whole lot of ring giving. That's just what they do. They didn't have Netflix back in the day. That's how they had a good time. Eventually, though, Beowulf says, you know what, guys, this is great. I'm having a blast, but it's about time I'd be heading on home. So he goes back to Keepland, and there's a lengthy recap to King Hygelac of everything that's happened before. We know this already. You've just read it. But Beowulf does this recap, but he adds an interesting prediction about Heorot. He says Heorot is going to be destroyed in about 10 or 15 years' time. Hrothgar, all his sons, they end up perishing in a blood feud, says Beowulf, with the Heathobards. Now, if you think about it, this is something that Beowulf can't actually know, but the poem's audience does, since oral societies usually tend to know all their stories through tradition. So Beowulf's prediction is not something that would have been unexpected to its audience. Wouldn't have thrown them for a loop. King Hrothgar, by the way, probably was a real person, historically speaking. We do have some documentation that he actually did die in a feud with the Heathobards. At any rate, about 50 years pass, and Beowulf, through a long process, a complicated scenario, he is now king of the Geats. Enter the dragon. Basically, some nameless thief slips into the dragon's cave and steals a golden goblet. And the dragon, who's pretty attached to his treasure, as you might imagine, he just goes bonkers, rampaging and ravaging throughout the countryside. Because, you know, dragon's gonna dragon. Then the Beowulf poet, he interrupts the action for a long narrative digression explaining how Beowulf had become king in the first place. In short, although he was King Hygelac's nephew, Beowulf was never actually Hygelac's direct heir, but Hygelac dies in this war against the Frisians, and then his son, Heardred, he gets murdered by some treacherous outlaws from Sweden, so Beowulf's only royalty left. But he's not afraid of this dragon, as you guys know, because he's faced a lot of similar dangers before. So he gathers 12 men, forms a company, and forces the original thief to join them as well, just because. And then there's another long, lengthy digression, this time discussing the Geats' feud with the Swedes, which you guys don't really have to know about in any detail, but does get mentioned again in about 400 lines. Incidentally, this incident with Beowulf, with the thief and the dragon, that should be familiar to anybody who's read The Hobbit or seen the Peter Jackson films. Obviously, Tolkien's book has a dragon named Smaug, and has a burglar, which is a type of thief, named Bilbo Baggins. And when the dwarfs in the book send Bilbo in to steal something from Smaug's treasure, guess what he steals? I'll give you 3 guesses, but you're only going to need 1. He steals a golden cup, like a goblet. That's right. Tolkien plagiarizes Beowulf, but it's okay because the poem's out of copyright. Still, it goes to show you just how a modern writer can reuse and rework older medieval material. So anyway, the dragon's now fully awake, and Beowulf is there with his posse, ready to slay the beast. Unfortunately, one slight problem. When Beowulf starts fighting the dragon, his sword, Nightling, snaps into crack, and Beowulf's posse all run away like the total chumps they are. Still, Beowulf is too much of a hero to back down at this point. But you'll notice, he's also taken this fight much more seriously than his earlier fight with Grendel. There, as you remember, Beowulf had removed all his armor and clothes and fought the monster with his bare hands. With the dragon, he's not taking any chances, hence the sword. But he's also king of Geatland, and he knows he shouldn't be taking foolish risks. Still, he does make this interesting statement in line 2510. He says, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning. So, his fight with the dragon, it's not absolutely about protecting its people. It's not about saving the countryside necessarily. It's more like, I'm going to fight this monster because I want poets to sing more songs about my deeds. And what's weird from a modern perspective is how completely cruel that is in Beowulf's world. Nobody has a problem with that sort of sentiment. Beowulf is a warrior king, and he's saying exactly the kind of thing that people in heroic society expect a warrior king to say. But now Beowulf is all alone, except for his loyal retainer, Wiglaf, who bravely stays. Wiglaf is like the Sam Gamgee of this poem. He's the heroic little buddy. He vows to protect his lord Beowulf. He attacks the dragon, which enables Beowulf just enough time to deal the dragon a killing blow, but in the process, he gets mortally injured, and he dies after taking a quick peek at the dragon's treasure. Finally, we get to the last section of the poem, Beowulf's funeral. Wiglaf is there. In fact, he's the only one who can hang his head up high, because he's the only one who didn't run away. And then he shames all the warriors who did flee. But then Wiglaf starts predicting destruction. As he says, now war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known among the Franks and Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. The Swedes will attack too, and Wiglaf repeats the Geats' long dispute with them, including how they had murdered the previous Geatish king, Heardred. Think about it. This is a very violent culture. There's lots of men dying, there's lots of women grieving. All the men that we get in the poem are warriors. Beowulf had kept the Geats safe for 50 years. Then he dies without an heir after his duel with the dragon. Who's left to protect the Geats? And remember, the Geats are absolutely surrounded by enemies. You have the Swedes, who are always badasses. You got the Franks, the Frisians, the Danes, the Heathobards. All these people, once they realize that Beowulf, the hero, is gone, they're going to go in and wreck some meat benches, burn some meat halls, take some tribute and some slaves, just like Shield Sheepson did back in the day. There's nothing stopping them. So what Wiglaf is saying here, there's no optimism. There's no happy ending. We've already found out what happened to Hrothgar and the Danes after Beowulf leaves. 15 years later, they're wiped out by the Heathobards. So Beowulf coming and saving the day from Grendel and Grendel's mother, in the long run, that only buys them maybe a decade of peace and happiness. 15 years, tops. And then they're slaughtered in a blood feud. And that is what's going to happen to the Geats. That's why you have Wiglaf repeating this long dispute with the Swedes that Beowulf had already mentioned 400 lines earlier. The Swedes are going to wipe them out. So, Beowulf's funeral. The dragon's corpse, they toss that over a cliff. Beowulf is set on a pier, which is set afire, and then there's eulogy. He's praised as gracious and kind, and as the keenest to win fame. That's how the poem ends. Now, monster analysis time. What can we say about the dragon itself? Well, like Scold, it's very protective of its hoard. The only physical description we get is that it's 50 feet long and it breathes fire. On line 2715, we also know that it has maybe poisonous claws. Beowulf dies from poisonous wounds. And all these factoids about the dragon, except maybe the poison, those have, interestingly, survived into the modern popular folklore about dragons. Big, fire-breathing, all that. So except for the dragon Fafnir in the Norse saga, Volsunga saga, this episode from Beowulf is the primary responsible text for most of Western literature's best tradition about dragons. Otherwise, though, the dragon in this poem is just a dumb animal. There's nothing of the fascinating questions about where you draw the line between human and monstrous that you get with Grendel or Grendel's mother. The dragon is just a dangerous kind of beast, much like a panther or a lion. Although Tolkien, as we see in Due Date 5, he thinks the dragon is symbolic of greed and death. That, I'll let you guys judge that one for yourselves. But anyway, I hope this clears up the last third of the poem. Thank you for tuning in.